The morning Ryan disappeared, his mother ironed a small crease into the left pocket of his khaki shorts, a habit she'd picked up from her own mother, something about keeping fabric from bunching. It was May 14th, a Thursday, and the kind of spring morning when sunlight comes through kitchen windows at that low angle that makes dust particles visible in the air. Ryan was 11, skinny-limbed and serious, the kind of boy who arranged his action figures by height and asked questions adults couldn't answer. He wore a red cotton t-shirt with a faded Superman logo and brown leather sandals his father had bought 2 sizes too big so he could grow into them. The sandals made a specific sound on the linoleum, a soft slap shuffle that his mother would later hear in her sleep for years. She handed him his lunch bag. Inside, a peanut butter sandwich cut diagonally, an apple, a juice box. He slung his backpack over one shoulder and walked the 4 blocks to Riverside Elementary the same way he always did. Past the Hendersons' garden, where Mrs. Henderson grew tomatoes that hung heavy on their vines, past the corner store with the faded Coca-Cola mural, past the fire hydrant someone had painted to look like a Dalmatian. 3 different neighbors saw him that morning. Mrs. Chen watched from her porch. Mr. Vasquez waved from his truck. The crossing guard, Paula, remembered he'd asked her if clouds ever ran out of rain. By 3:15 that afternoon, when Ryan didn't come home, his mother stood at the kitchen window, watching that same sunlight change angles, waiting for the sound of those 2 big sandals on the front steps. The house felt different when silence stretched past 4 o'clock. Claire Arden had learned to read time by the rhythms of her son's return, the front door opening, the backpack hitting the floor with that particular thud, his voice calling out, asking what was for snack. When none of those sounds came, she stepped onto the porch and looked down the street, expecting to see him walking slowly, distracted by something interesting, maybe stopping to examine an anthill or watch a bird. The street was empty except for Mr. Vasquez watering his lawn, the spray catching light in tiny rainbows. If you're drawn to stories where patience and procedure slowly illuminate the impossible, consider subscribing. We bring you these cases with the respect and detail they deserve. And drop a comment, where in the world are you watching from tonight? She called his best friend's house first. No, Tyler's mother said. Ryan hadn't come home with Tyler. She called 2 other mothers. No one had seen him. By 4:30, when Martin arrived home from the high school where he taught chemistry, Claire was pacing the kitchen with the cordless phone pressed to her ear, talking to the school secretary who was checking with the after-school program coordinator. No, they confirmed, Ryan hadn't signed in for any activities. Yes, his teacher had seen him leave through the main doors at dismissal. That's when Martin called the police. Sergeant DeMarco arrived with a younger officer named Brennan, who carried a clipboard and wore an expression that tried for reassuring but landed somewhere near concerned. DeMarco was compact and methodical, the kind of man who'd probably been a wrestler in high school, with reading glasses on a chain around his neck. He sat at the kitchen table and asked questions in a voice that stayed level. What was Ryan wearing? Did he have any money? Had there been any arguments at home? Any recent changes in behavior? Martin and Claire answered in tandem, sometimes finishing each other's sentences, both of them speaking faster than normal. Red shirt, brown sandals, maybe $2 in his pocket. No arguments, no changes. He was a good kid, a careful kid, the kind who looked both ways twice before crossing streets. The officers walked Ryan's route while Claire stayed by the phone, and Martin drove slowly through the neighborhood, scanning yards and alleys, stopping to ask anyone he saw if they'd noticed a boy in a red shirt. The Hendersons hadn't seen him pass their house coming back, which meant something had happened between school and their corner, a distance of less than 3 blocks. That realization made Martin's chest tighten. 3 blocks. You could walk 3 blocks in under 5 minutes. Whatever had happened fast. By evening, more officers had arrived. They brought tracking dogs who picked up Ryan's scent, heading east on 4th Street toward the old textile mill. A sprawling brick structure that had been abandoned for a decade, its windows broken, its loading docks tagged with graffiti. The dogs led them to the mill's north entrance, then lost the trail in a confusion of competing smells: motor oil, rotting wood, something chemical. Inside, they found evidence of recent human presence: cigarette butts, empty beer cans, a sleeping bag someone had left behind. But nothing that belonged to Ryan. No red shirt, no backpack, no sandals. That first night, Claire didn't sleep. She sat on the living room couch with every light in the house turned on, her ears tuned to the front door, convinced that any moment she'd hear it open, and Ryan would walk in with some perfectly reasonable explanation. Martin stayed with her until dawn, not speaking much, both of them suspended in that terrible space between hope and dread. When the sun came up on Friday morning and Ryan still hadn't come home, the case changed categories. He wasn't a boy who'd lost track of time. He was missing. The mobilization happened quickly. By Friday afternoon, volunteers from the neighborhood had organized into search parties with color-coded maps dividing the area into grids. They walked through parks, drainage ditches, construction sites, anywhere a child might have wandered or hidden or been taken. Paula, the crossing guard, joined every search, moving slowly through vacant lots with her eyes scanning the ground. Mrs. Chen brought coffee in thermoses. Mr. Vasquez used his truck to transport supplies. The Ardens' living room became an operations center with folding tables covered in maps and phone logs and stacks of flyers printed at the local copy shop. Ryan's school photo stared out from every sheet. Missing, the text read, followed by his height, weight, and the clothes he'd been wearing. Police established a tip line. In the first 72 hours, it logged over 200 calls. A woman in the next county reported seeing a boy matching Ryan's description at a gas station, holding hands with a man she described as nervous-looking. Officers drove an hour to interview her and review the station's surveillance footage. The boy in the video was younger and blonde. A truck driver called to say he'd seen a child matching Ryan's description getting into a dark sedan near the interstate entrance. That lead consumed an entire day of investigative work, tracking the vehicle through partial plate numbers, locating the owner, discovering it was a divorced father picking up his own son from soccer practice, confirming the timeline through the coach and time-stamped photos. Each false lead carried its own small death, hope rising, then crashing. On day 5, the FBI sent 2 agents to consult. They brought databases and protocols and a certain clinical efficiency that both helped and hurt. Helpful because they had resources local police lacked. Hurtful because their presence meant Ryan's case had crossed a threshold into something statistically grimmer. Special Agent Torres was maybe 40, with kind eyes and a wedding ring she twisted when she talked. She explained the realities gently. Most abducted children are taken by family members or acquaintances. Strangers are rare. Time matters enormously. She asked permission to interview Ryan's extended family, his teachers, his coaches, anyone who had regular contact. Martin and Claire agreed to everything, signed every form, submitted to questioning that sometimes felt accusatory but which they understood was necessary. The polygraph examinations happened on day 6. Martin and Claire took them separately in a windowless room at the police station, sensors attached to their fingers and chests, questions designed to eliminate them as suspects. Both passed. DeMarco had never seriously considered them. Their grief was too raw, their cooperation too complete, but protocol required elimination. With the parents cleared, the investigation expanded outward in concentric circles. Officers interviewed registered sex offenders within a 20-mile radius. They pulled surveillance footage from businesses along possible routes Ryan might have taken or been taken. They checked bus station records, train manifests, airport logs for any child traveling without proper documentation. Summer arrived with the kind of heat that makes asphalt shimmer. Ryan's 12th birthday came on June 8th, a Saturday. Claire baked his favorite cake, chocolate with vanilla frosting, and set it on the kitchen table with 12 candles she couldn't bring herself to light. Martin found her standing at the counter at midnight, one hand on the cake, crying in a way he'd never heard before, a sound that came from somewhere deeper than lungs. He held her and didn't say anything because there was nothing to say. Their son was 12 and missing, and the cake was just flour and sugar arranged to look like normalcy. The investigation continued, but shifted in tone. Detective work became less about immediate rescue and more about patient accumulation of data. Agent Torres returned to her field office, but stayed in regular contact with DeMarco, comparing Ryan's case to others in the national database. She found 2 other disappearances from the previous year that shared surface similarities. Boys between 10 and 13, taken during daylight hours while walking alone in residential areas, no witnesses to actual abduction. One of those boys had been found 6 weeks later in a Maryland motel with a drifter named Carl Simmons, who claimed the boy had asked for help and he'd been trying to find the right authorities to contact. Simmons was arrested, charged with kidnapping and child endangerment, eventually convicted. The boy, traumatized but physically unharmed, returned to his family. The second boy, 11-year-old Marcus from Pennsylvania, remained missing. Torres shared Simmons's case file with DeMarco, who studied it for patterns. Simmons had no prior record of violence, but a long history of vagrancy, mental health issues, and what psychologists termed rescue fantasy syndrome, a delusional belief that he was helping children escape abusive situations. Under interrogation, he'd admitted to approaching the Maryland boy after watching him from a park bench for several days, convincing himself the child looked sad and neglected. When the boy had walked past his bench, Simmons had offered him candy and a ride to somewhere better. The boy, confused and scared, had gotten in the car. Simmons claimed he'd intended to take him to a police station, but had kept driving, kept delaying, kept telling himself he needed to make sure the boy was really safe first. DeMarco cross-referenced Simmons's travel patterns with dates and locations related to Ryan's disappearance. Nothing matched. Simmons had been in Maryland the entire month of May 2012, verified through motel receipts and traffic citations. He wasn't their man, but the case illustrated a possibility. Maybe Ryan had been taken by someone who'd convinced himself he was doing good, someone whose logic operated on rails invisible to normal reasoning. It was a theory that made Martin feel simultaneously better and worse. Better because it suggested Ryan might still be alive. Worse because it meant his son might be with someone whose delusions made him unpredictable. The summer passed in a blur of search parties and false sightings and vigils, organized by people from church who wanted to help, but didn't know how. Claire returned to work at the library in August, partly because they needed her income, partly because staying home meant sitting in rooms where Ryan's absence pressed against her like atmospheric pressure. Her colleagues tried to be supportive, avoiding mentions of children's programs or back-to-school book displays, but every child who came through the library doors with his mother made Claire's breath catch. She developed strategies. She worked the reference desk instead of circulation, stayed in the back office during story hour, took her lunch breaks in her car where she could cry without witnesses. Martin went back to teaching in September, but found he couldn't explain chemical bonds without his mind wandering to Ryan, to wherever he was, to whether he was hungry or scared or still alive. His students noticed his distraction, but were kind about it. Word had spread about his missing son, and teenagers, despite their reputation for self-absorption, can be remarkably gentle when confronted with real suffering. They turned in their homework without complaint. They didn't act up in class. They left small notes on his desk sometimes, praying for Ryan or "don't give up," written in the uncertain handwriting of 15-year-olds trying to express comfort they didn't have vocabulary for. DeMarco kept working the case even as other investigations demanded his attention. He re-interviewed witnesses every few months, hoping time would shake loose forgotten details. He maintained a relationship with Torres, who sent him updates whenever a new case entered the database that might connect to Ryan's disappearance. On Ryan's 13th birthday, DeMarco drove to the Ardens' house and sat with them in the living room, updating them on investigative dead ends with an honesty that was both cruel and kind. There were no active leads. The tip line had gone quiet. The case was cold. But cold didn't mean closed. DeMarco kept Ryan's file on his desk, and every few weeks he'd pull it out and read through it again, looking for something everyone had missed. He studied the maps, the witness statements, the timeline of that Thursday afternoon. He visited the textile mill sometimes, walking through its ruins, trying to understand what had happened there. The dogs had lost Ryan's scent inside the building, which suggested either he'd been carried out, or he'd left through a different exit, or the scent trail had been contaminated by other smells. The mill had 6 different exits, multiple loading docks, and a basement level that flooded every spring. It was a labyrinth of possibilities. Years accumulated quietly. Ryan would have been 14, 15, 16. The Ardens kept his room exactly as he'd left it. Bed unmade, a library book 3 weeks overdue on his nightstand, a half-finished sketch of a spaceship taped above his desk. Claire washed his sheets every 2 weeks, hung them in the sun, folded them back onto his bed. It was a ritual that gave her something to do, a way to parent a child who wasn't there. She joined a support group for families of missing children, sat in a church basement every Tuesday evening, listening to stories that mirrored her own. The not knowing, the false hopes, the way holidays became minefields, the friends who drifted away because tragedy made them uncomfortable. Martin developed his own rituals. Every evening at 6, he walked Ryan's route from house to school and back, timing himself, photographing changes in the neighborhood. He noticed the way light fell differently, depending on season and cloud cover, how the mill's shadow stretched across 4th Street after 4 o'clock in winter, but didn't reach the street in summer. He documented the smell of diesel from the bus depot 3 blocks south, the sound of trains passing on tracks half a mile east, the pattern of traffic during school dismissal. He built an archive of the ordinary, convinced that somewhere in these details lay an answer. DeMarco retired in year 8, but before he left, he made sure Ryan's case was transferred to someone who would care. Detective Sarah Kowalski was 34, methodical and patient, the kind of investigator who believed that every case was solvable if you asked the right questions in the right order. She'd built a reputation for solving cold cases through sheer persistence, re-interviewing witnesses a decade later, finding new forensic techniques to apply to old evidence, following leads that seemed ridiculous until they weren't. She requested every file related to Ryan's disappearance, spent 2 weeks reading them chronologically, making notes in margins, building timelines on her office wall with string-connecting dates and locations and people. Something caught her attention. In the month before Ryan vanished, 3 other boys from neighboring districts had disappeared under loosely similar circumstances. Daylight abductions, residential areas, no witnesses. 2 had been found. 1, the Maryland boy taken by Carl Simmons, had been recovered. Another, taken from a parking lot in Ohio, had been found 3 months later, living with a couple who'd been posing as his parents, having convinced him his real family had abandoned him. That couple was arrested, charged, convicted. The 3rd boy, Marcus, from Pennsylvania, remained missing. Kowalski mapped all 4 disappearances. They formed a rough geographic arc spanning 200 miles. She started looking for connections. What linked these locations? Were there businesses with branches in multiple towns, trucking routes, employment patterns? She requested personnel records from school districts, cross-referencing employees who'd worked in more than one of the affected areas. One name appeared 3 times, Leonard Price, a maintenance worker who'd been fired from districts in 2 different counties for boundary violations with students. Nothing criminal, no touching, but inappropriate conversations, standing too close, asking personal questions that made administrators uncomfortable enough to terminate him. Price had worked at Riverside Elementary from 2010 to 2011, fired in November after a parent complained he'd asked her daughter what time she walked home from school and whether she walked alone. Kowalski felt something shift in her chest. That particular sensation investigators learned to recognize as intuition backed by evidence. Price had been in the right places at the right times. He'd had access. He'd demonstrated boundary problems. She ran his criminal history, one arrest for loitering near a playground in 2009, charges dropped. No convictions, no registry status, nothing that would have flagged him during the initial investigation into Ryan's disappearance. She tried to locate him through DMV records. His driver's license had expired in 2015. His last known address was a rental property in the next county, but the landlord said Price had moved out 6 years earlier, left no forwarding information. Kowalski started the slow work of tracking him. She followed him through utility connections to a small town in Tennessee, then to Georgia, then to Arkansas, where the trail fragmented into cash jobs and disconnected phones. Price was living off the grid in the way people do when they're not actively hiding, but prefer invisibility. She filed paperwork flagging his social security number in case he applied for benefits or housing assistance. She contacted police in cities where he'd lived, asking them to check storage units, old addresses, anywhere he might have kept belongings. Most came back empty. But a detective in Georgia found something. Price had rented a storage unit under a false name in 2016, paid cash for 3 years, then abandoned it when his payments lapsed. The facility had auctioned the contents. Kowalski tracked down the buyer. Inside the auctioned unit's contents, now scattered among a reseller's inventory, she found journals. Leonard Price had kept detailed records of his life, writing in careful block letters about his beliefs, his frustrations, his conviction that he understood children better than their parents did. He wrote about rescuing kids from toxic environments, about guests he'd hosted over the years, about his certainty that he was providing sanctuary. The journals didn't use real names, but they included dates and descriptions. One entry from May 2012 read, "New guest today, smart kid, asks good questions about clouds. We'll teach him what real family means." Kowalski felt cold reading those words. She kept going through the journals, finding entries that tracked years, guests settling in, learning that old life was a lie. Guests tried to leave, had to relocate. He'll understand eventually. Guest turned 19 today. Getting harder to manage. Might need to let him figure things out on his own. The entries stopped in late 2018. The final one read, "Stroke, hospital, had to leave. Hope he finds his way." She called the Ardens. It was a Wednesday evening in March, year 13. Claire answered. Kowalski said, "I think I've found something. I need you both on the line." Martin picked up the extension. Kowalski explained about Price, the journals, the timeline that matched Ryan's disappearance. She said she was working with law enforcement in multiple states to locate Price and determine if Ryan was still alive. She warned them this might take time. Claire asked one question. "Do you think my son is out there?" Kowalski chose her words carefully. "I think someone took him. I think that person kept him for years. I think when that person became unable to care for him, Ryan was released or escaped. What happened after that, I don't know yet." Martin said, "But he'd be 24 now. If he's alive, why hasn't he come home?" Kowalski said, "That's what we're going to find out." She intensified the search for Price, eventually locating him through a Medicaid application in Arkansas. He was living in a subsidized apartment, partially paralyzed from his stroke, working part-time at a storage facility. Kowalski coordinated with Arkansas State Police for his arrest. They took him on a Tuesday morning, executing a search warrant simultaneously. Inside his apartment, more journals, photographs of children cut from newspapers and school yearbooks, maps with locations circled. In his storage unit at the facility where he worked, boxes of children's clothing organized by size, toys still in packaging, a collection of fake IDs with his photo and different names. Price was charged with kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, child endangerment. During interrogation, he initially claimed innocence, then confusion, then began speaking about his mission to save children from parents who didn't appreciate them. He admitted to taking Ryan. He admitted to keeping him for 8 years, moving him between rental houses in 4 different states, telling him his parents had died, that police were looking to put him in foster care, that the outside world was dangerous. He said Ryan had been a model guest until his late teens, when he'd started questioning Price's stories and demanding to leave. Price claimed his stroke had made it impossible to prevent Ryan's departure. He said Ryan had fled while Price was in the hospital. He had no idea where Ryan had gone after that. Kowalski asked the question that mattered most. "Is Ryan alive?" Price said, "I don't know. I haven't seen him since 2018. He left with $40 and the clothes he was wearing. He was angry. I tried to tell him he needed to stay, that I'd protected him, but he wouldn't listen." Price seemed genuinely bewildered that his protection wasn't appreciated. The investigation expanded to find Ryan. Police circulated age-progressed photos to shelters, hospitals, social services agencies across the South. They checked missing persons databases for unidentified individuals found between 2018 and present. They flagged his name in every system they could access. Kowalski felt urgency pressing against her chest. If Ryan had survived until 2018, if he'd escaped, there was a chance he was still out there, maybe without identification, maybe scared to come forward, maybe not entirely sure who he was after 8 years of captivity and lies. Then, 6 weeks after Price's arrest, a call came from a genealogy database company. They'd been contacted by law enforcement in Kentucky about an unidentified deceased individual found in February 2019. A cousin of the Ardens had uploaded DNA for ancestry research, and the database had flagged a partial match. Not definitive, but close enough to warrant investigation. The deceased was a male, estimated mid-20s, found in an abandoned warehouse in Louisville, dead from hypothermia. He'd been carrying no identification. His body had been logged into the national database for unidentified persons, his DNA stored, waiting for a match. Kowalski called the Ardens immediately. She explained about the database hit, the partial match, the need for formal testing to confirm. She said she was coordinating with Kentucky authorities to compare Ryan's dental records and run a full DNA panel. It would take time. Martin asked how the person had died. Kowalski said exposure, no signs of recent trauma, likely homeless and disoriented during a cold snap. Claire made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Martin said, "We'll wait." The dental records matched first. Ryan had a distinctive filling pattern from childhood cavities. 2 molars on the upper left, 1 on the lower right, specific materials and configurations that were documented in his pediatric dentist's files. The deceased man had identical dental work. Same teeth, same materials, same placement. The probability of coincidence was essentially 0. DNA testing confirmed it 3 days later with statistical certainty. The unidentified man found frozen in a Louisville warehouse was Ryan Arden, aged 23 years and 8 months, 6 years after his escape from Leonard Price, 7 years after he should have come home. Kowalski drove to the Ardens' house with a victim advocate. It was a Thursday afternoon, same day of the week Ryan had disappeared 13 years earlier. Claire opened the door and looked at Kowalski's face and said, "He's dead." It wasn't a question. They sat in the living room, where Claire had spent that first sleepless night. Kowalski explained everything she knew. The warehouse, the timeline, the evidence suggesting Ryan had been homeless for months before his death, the notebook found with his body. She described the notebook carefully, spiral-bound, water-damaged, filled with drawings of spaceships and repeated writings of his own name, as if he'd been trying to hold on to his identity. One page had Ryan Arden, Riverside Elementary, written dozens of times. Another had partial addresses, none quite right, as if he'd been trying to remember where home was. There were drawings of buildings that might have been the textile mill, sketches of a fire hydrant, a crude map with street names that didn't exist. The notebook suggested he'd retained memory, but had lost specifics. That trauma and time had eroded the precise details that would have helped him find his way. There was also evidence he'd tried. Louisville police had reviewed shelter records and found his description matching a man who'd sought help 3 different times, always giving a different name, always leaving before intake paperwork was completed. Social workers remembered him as polite but confused, unable to provide consistent information, possibly suffering from PTSD or dissociative disorder. Martin asked about suffering. Kowalski said the medical examiner believed hypothermia death was relatively peaceful, that he would have become confused and drowsy before losing consciousness. She didn't mention the autopsy findings she'd read, evidence of old fractures that had healed incorrectly, malnutrition patterns, scarring consistent with restraints. She didn't mention that Ryan's final months had clearly been desperate, that he'd died alone in a building with no heat, wearing inadequate clothing, that he'd been trying to survive in a world he no longer knew how to navigate. She gave them the comfort the facts allowed, and let them fill in the rest according to their capacity to bear it. They buried Ryan on a Saturday in October, 13 years and 5 months after he'd walked past the Dalmatian fire hydrant, asking questions about rain. The funeral was small. Family, police who'd worked his case, neighbors who'd never stopped leaving the porch light on, Paula the crossing guard who'd always wondered if she'd missed something that morning. Claire placed Ryan's old red Superman shirt in the casket, along with the brown leather sandals she'd kept in her closet, still shaped by his small feet. Martin read from a book about stars, something Ryan had loved when he was 10 and thought astronomy meant magic instead of math. People spoke about resilience and tragedy and the particular cruelty of hope deferred. The trial of Leonard Price began 3 months later. Prosecutors charged him with kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, and felony murder, arguing that Ryan's death was a direct result of Price's actions, that releasing a young man with no identification, no resources, and severe psychological trauma into a February night was tantamount to killing him. The defense argued Price had let Ryan go, that what happened after wasn't his responsibility, that he'd been incapacitated by stroke and couldn't have prevented Ryan's departure. The jury deliberated 4 hours. They convicted on all counts. The judge sentenced Price to 4 consecutive life terms without possibility of parole. During the sentencing hearing, Claire Arden read a victim impact statement. She described 13 years of not knowing, of walking past the milk aisle in grocery stores and remembering Ryan's favorite cereal, of waking at 3 in the morning convinced she'd heard his voice, of the particular torture of hope that wouldn't die even when logic said it should. She described learning he'd been alive, kept in basements and rental houses, told lies about his family, prevented from coming home. She described learning he'd died alone, cold, trying to find his way back to an address he couldn't quite remember. She looked at Price when she said, "You stole 13 years. You stole his childhood. You stole his future. And when you finally let him go, you stole his ability to survive. You killed my son twice, once when you took him, and once when you released him without the tools to come home." Martin didn't speak. He sat beside Claire and held her hand and looked at Price with an expression that contained everything words couldn't hold. After the trial, the Ardens started the Ryan Arden Center for Missing Children Recovery and Family Support. It began small, a website, a mailing address, a small grant from a victim services organization. The center focused on 3 areas: funding advanced DNA testing for unidentified remains, providing long-term therapy for families experiencing ambiguous loss, and training law enforcement in trauma-informed investigation of missing children cases. Within 2 years, the center had helped identify 6 previously unidentified remains through genealogy database matches, connected 40 families with therapists specializing in complex grief, and trained police departments in 3 states on protocols for working with families of the missing. Claire began speaking at conferences about the specific challenges of ambiguous loss, that psychological space where someone is physically absent but not confirmed dead, where hope and grief coexist in toxic combination. She talked about the importance of maintaining dual consciousness, preparing for the worst while remaining open to the best, acknowledging that both outcomes require different kinds of strength. She was honest about how it felt to finally know, how confirmation brought its own relief, even wrapped in devastation, how the not knowing had been its own particular torture. Martin developed educational programs for schools about personal safety that didn't terrify children, but empowered them with practical skills, memorizing addresses and phone numbers, understanding trusted adult networks, recognizing manipulation tactics, knowing that saying no and making noise were always acceptable. He tested the programs with child psychologists to ensure they built confidence rather than fear. Dozens of schools across 3 states adopted his curriculum. On May 14th every year, the anniversary of Ryan's disappearance, they visited his grave and then walked his route from house to school. The Dalmatian fire hydrant had been repainted twice, but the tradition continued. Neighborhood kids maintained it as a small memorial, adding new spots when the old ones faded. The corner store mural had been restored by a local artist who'd heard Ryan's story and wanted to contribute something permanent. Mrs. Henderson's garden still grew tomatoes, and every summer she'd leave a basket at the Ardens' door with a note. Ryan always liked watching these grow. The Ardens never moved houses. For years they'd told themselves it was in case Ryan came back and couldn't remember the way. After his death, they stayed because leaving felt like abandonment, like erasing the last physical space he'd known before Price took him. His room remained a museum. Bed made with the sheets Claire had washed 2,000 times, desk holding that half-finished spaceship drawing, walls covered in posters from a childhood that had been interrupted too soon. They'd go in sometimes and sit on his bed and remember him not as the young man who'd died confused and alone in Kentucky, but as the 11-year-old who'd asked if clouds ran out of rain, who'd arranged action figures by height, who'd worn sandals that made a particular sound on linoleum. The case file officially closed, marked solved, filed into the storage system where solved cases go. But the center's work continued, expanding into new areas, advocating for national databases that could cross-reference DNA more efficiently, pushing for laws requiring better tracking of transient populations, funding research into the psychological effects of long-term captivity on developing brains, providing reintegration support for the rare cases where missing children returned alive. Because the truth the Ardens had earned through 13 years of suffering, was that every case deserved the same attention, the same resources, the same refusal to give up that DeMarco and Kowalski had shown. Sometimes people asked Claire if she regretted the years of hope, if not knowing sooner had made the grief worse. She'd think about it carefully before answering, because the question deserved care. She'd say that hope had kept her breathing when despair would have stopped her lungs, that not knowing had been torture, but also life support, that the human mind finds ways to survive unbearable situations by bargaining with reality. She'd say that knowing, finally knowing, had brought a different kind of pain, but also a strange relief, that she could finally stop scanning crowds for Ryan's face, stop flinching when the phone rang, stop holding her breath every time someone said they had news. She'd say that grief with answers was survivable in ways that ambiguous loss wasn't, that her mind had finally been allowed to complete the process it had been trying to start for 13 years. The notebook from Kentucky sat in a locked drawer in Claire's desk at home. She'd read it once, shortly after the police returned Ryan's belongings. She'd traced the words he'd written, his name repeated, addresses half-remembered, questions to himself about directions and years and whether his parents were real or part of the constructed reality Price had built. There were drawings that showed his mind still worked the way it had at 11, the same style of spaceships, the same careful attention to detail. There were also pages that showed fracturing, words scratched out violently, angry marks that tore the paper, one page that just said, "Home, home, home, home," until the pen ran out. She'd closed the notebook and locked it away and hadn't opened it since. Some artifacts were too heavy to hold more than once. Martin kept the photograph from the morning Ryan disappeared on his desk at the center's office. Ryan at the kitchen table, milk moustache, red Superman shirt, face open and uncomplicated by knowledge of what was coming. Next to it, Martin placed one of the spaceship drawings from the Kentucky notebook, the one labeled "Home" in handwriting that had grown up without them. Between the two images stretched 13 years of absence, but also evidence that even in the worst darkness, Ryan had carried them with him. He'd drawn spaceships. He'd written their names. He'd tried to find his way back to the sound of two big sandals on linoleum, to the light through kitchen windows, to the mother who ironed creases into pockets, and the father who taught chemistry and believed in answering questions honestly. The young man who'd impersonated Ryan, Marcus Lyle, completed his probation and eventually contacted the center. He'd been following their work online, had gotten sober, had started therapy to address the desperation that had led him to exploit a family's tragedy. He asked if he could volunteer, if there was any way to make amends. Claire met with him at a coffee shop. She listened to his apologies and his explanations and his obvious shame. She thought about it for a long time, whether justice meant exclusion or whether redemption required offering pathways back. She told him he could help with data entry, behind-the-scenes work, nothing public. He agreed. 2 years later, he was managing the center's database of unidentified remains, cross-referencing DNA markers, flagging possible matches. He was good at it, meticulous, careful, motivated by a need to balance scales he'd tipped in the wrong direction. Sometimes Claire would see him in the office and feel a complicated mix of emotions. Anger at what he'd done, gratitude for what he'd become, sorrow that anyone got desperate enough to impersonate a missing child. She'd think about how brokenness manifests in different ways, how Price's brokenness had destroyed lives while Marcus's had only added pain to existing tragedy. She'd think about the difference between evil and desperation, between cruelty and damage. She'd think about Ryan, about whether he'd have forgiven Marcus, and she'd decide that he would have, that the boy who asked about clouds running out of rain would have understood that people sometimes do terrible things from terrible places and still deserve the chance to do better. The center grew. Within 5 years, it had a full-time staff of 8, satellite offices in 2 states, partnerships with law enforcement agencies across the country. They'd helped close 47 cold cases through DNA matching, provided support to over 300 families, trained more than 2,000 officers in trauma-informed investigation techniques. Universities began studying their model. Other victim advocacy groups reached out for consultation. The Ardens appeared on panels and gave interviews and wrote articles about their work, always framing it as a way to give Ryan's death meaning, to transform their private tragedy into public good. On the 10th anniversary of Ryan's death, they held a memorial service at the center. Families they'd helped attended, along with law enforcement partners, volunteers, and community members who'd followed the center's growth. Claire spoke about transformation and purpose, about how suffering could either destroy you or be channeled into something that prevents others from suffering the same way. She talked about Ryan specifically, not as a case number or a cautionary tale, but as a real boy who'd loved Superman and asked impossible questions and died trying to find his way home. She said his story hadn't ended in that Louisville warehouse, that it continued through every case the center solved, every family they supported, every child who came home because someone asked the right questions in the right order. Martin didn't speak at the memorial. He stood beside Claire and listened and thought about the boy who'd walked out their door 13 years and 8 months earlier, wearing 2 big sandals and carrying questions about clouds. He thought about the parallel life Ryan should have had. Middle school and high school, first girlfriend, learning to drive, maybe college, maybe teaching chemistry like his father, maybe doing something completely different that would have surprised them. He thought about grandchildren he'd never meet, holidays that would forever have an empty chair, the specific texture of loss that doesn't heal so much as become incorporated into who you are. After the memorial, after everyone had left, Martin and Claire drove to the cemetery. They sat beside Ryan's grave in the evening light and didn't say much. The stone marker was simple. Ryan Thomas Arden, with his birth and death dates and a line underneath that read, "He tried to find his way home." Claire had chosen those words carefully, wanting something that acknowledged both his absence and his effort, that honored the fact that he'd never stopped being their son, even when he couldn't remember where their house was. Martin placed a small toy spaceship at the base of the stone, something he did every month, replacing it when weather damaged it, maintaining a ritual that connected the father he still was to the son who'd never stopped being. They sat until dark, then drove home to the house they'd kept unchanged, past the landmarks that had become sacred. Mrs. Henderson's garden, the corner store mural, the Dalmatian fire hydrant where they always paused. The neighborhood had aged around them. New families had moved in. Children who hadn't been born when Ryan disappeared now played on the same sidewalks, rode bikes past the same houses, walked to the same school. Life continued its relentless forward motion, indifferent to tragedy, which was both cruel and necessary. The Ardens had learned to exist within that motion, to keep breathing and working and finding meaning, even when meaning felt impossible. The brown leather sandals sat in Claire's closet still, preserved in a clear box, still shaped by Ryan's small feet. Sometimes she'd take them out and hold them and remember the sound they made on linoleum, that specific slap shuffle of a boy moving through his morning routine without knowledge that routine was about to end. She'd remember his voice asking what was for snack, his habit of leaving his backpack by the door, his careful way of arranging things. She'd remember him as he'd been, alive and curious and hers. Then she'd put the sandals back and return to the work of preventing other parents from needing boxes in closets, holding shoes their children would never outgrow. The center's mission statement, which Martin had written and Claire had edited, ended with a sentence they both believed: every missing child deserves the same effort, the same resources, the same refusal to give up. We honor Ryan by refusing to let any family face alone what we faced. We honor him by insisting that every case matters, every person matters, every lost child deserves to be brought home, whether that means reunion or resolution, answers or closure. We honor him by continuing to ask questions, to search databases, to follow leads, to believe that patience and procedure and love can illuminate even the darkest mysteries. And so they continued. Every day they woke up and went to work at the center Ryan's death had created. They answered calls from desperate families and coordinated with law enforcement and reviewed DNA matches and provided resources and maintained hope when hope felt absurd. They did it because they'd lived through the worst possible outcome and survived it and discovered that survival could have purpose if you chose to give it purpose. They did it because a boy in 2 big sandals had once asked if clouds ran out of rain, And that question deserved a world that protected curious children, that brought lost children home, that never stopped searching, even when searching seemed futile. They did it because Ryan had tried. In that Louisville warehouse, cold and confused, he'd still been trying. The notebook proved it. He'd written their names. He'd drawn maps. He'd remembered fragments of home, even when the specifics had been stolen by time and trauma. If he could try from that place of desperation and disorientation, they could try from their place of grief and clarity. They could build systems. They could change protocols. They could be the answer for other families that no one had been able to be for them. And sometimes, late at night when the center was closed and they sat together in the house where Ryan had once lived, they'd talk about him not as he'd died, but as he'd been. They'd remember stories. They'd laugh at things he'd said. They'd replay mornings at the kitchen table and camping trips, and the time he'd tried to teach himself to juggle and broken a lamp. They'd remember him as real and present and theirs, not as a tragedy, but as a person who'd existed fully and loved them and been loved in return. They'd remember him as Ryan. And in the remembering, he'd come home again. Not physically, not in ways that erased the loss, but in ways that made the loss bearable, in ways that let them keep living, in ways that transformed pain into purpose and purpose into legacy and legacy into something that might eventually feel like peace.